Herman Webster, Mudgett was not born into the dark world that would one day define his name. He entered the world in 1861 in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a place of modest homes and strict moral codes. To most neighbors, the Mudgetts were an ordinary family. Herman's father, Levi Horton Mudgett, was a farmer and house painter, stern but respected, and his mother, Sate, was deeply religious, raising her children under the heavy hand of piety. Yet within their youngest son there was already something brewing, something that could not be seen in the quiet family dinners or Sunday services. From an early age, Herman carried within him a fascination with death, a curiosity that blurred the line between learning and cruelty. Some say it began with animals, with the small creatures around his family's land. Chickens, cats, even rabbits became subjects of his curiosity. Other children saw farm animals as companions or livelihood. Herman saw something different. He wanted to know what was inside. And as the story often goes with those later revealed to be monsters, he learned to conceal these urges, tucking away his experiments in silence, carrying with him a mask of ordinary boyhood, while nurturing impulses that made him unlike anyone else around him. He was an intelligent child, gifted at school, drawn to books and medicine, but intelligence alone did not set him apart. It was the way he used it. While his classmates memorized lessons, Herman found ways to manipulate teachers, to cheat without being caught, to twist the rules so that he always came out ahead. Even as a boy, he carried the tools of deception like weapons in his pocket. Later in his memoir, Holmes would describe his early years as though he were no different from other boys, but the truth lingered in the shadows of his childhood. There is a story told, whether true or exaggerated by later generations, that when other boys once discovered Herman's fear of the village doctor's office, they dragged him inside and forced him to confront a human skeleton. While some children might have been traumatized, Herman instead was captivated. The sight of bones, clean and white, carefully displayed, shifted something inside him. Fear transformed into fascination. The skeleton was no longer a source of terror but a revelation, proof that the body could be studied, reduced, and controlled. That moment became a seed, one that would grow into a lifelong obsession. As Herman grew older, his curiosity sharpened into ambition. He wanted more than the modest life of his parents. He wanted wealth, power, and above all freedom from the moral constraints of the quiet, New England town that had shaped him. He pursued education with an unusual determination. By the time he entered medical school at the University of Michigan, Herman had already begun crafting the dual identity that would define him. To his professors he was a promising student, well-groomed, attentive, skilled in dissection. To his peers he was charming and clever, though often distrusted for his tendency to lie. And beneath it all, he was already experimenting with darker impulses. Medical schools in the mid-19th century were desperate for cadavers, often supplied by body snatchers who dug up the freshly buried dead. Herman quickly realized that corpses were not only tools for education, but opportunities for profit. He was accused more than once of stealing bodies, disfiguring them, and then using them to collect insurance money by claiming they were accident victims. It was a practice that revealed both his brilliance and his ruthlessness. He had found a way to turn death into business, and business into pleasure, and so the man who would later call himself H. Holmes began to take shape, not as a monster born overnight, but as one carefully cultivated through opportunity, ambition, and an utter lack of conscience. By the time he left medical school, Herman Mudgett was no longer content with the name he was born with. He needed reinvention. He needed a new identity to match the life he envisioned. He abandoned his family name and adopted the one the world would remember, Henry Howard Holmes, or simply H. Holmes. The choice was deliberate, almost theatrical, echoing Sherlock Holmes, the great detective of literature. But where Arthur Conan Doyle's creation embodied reason and justice, this Holmes embodied deception and cruelty. The name was a mask, one that would allow him to move through society undetected, charming employers, seducing women, and deceiving creditors, all while hiding his true nature. Holmes was tall, well-dressed, and impeccably groomed, with dark hair, piercing eyes, and a disarming smile. He spoke with confidence, carried himself with authority, and seemed to possess an endless charm. Women were drawn to him, men found him trustworthy, and strangers found themselves disarmed by his manner. But those who came too close often disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions and silence. His first marriages, to Clara Lovering and later to Martha Belknap, revealed his ability to weave lies with ease. He courted women with promises of love and security, then abandoned them, leaving behind confusion and betrayal. He lived double lives, marrying one woman while still married to another, slipping from town to town, under new names whenever his schemes caught up with him. When Holmes arrived in Chicago in 1886, he had already built a history of fraud, theft, and deception. Chicago was the perfect place for him to vanish into the crowd. The city was booming, growing into a metropolis of industry and opportunity. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition was on the horizon, promising millions of visitors from around the world. For Holmes, it was the stage he had been waiting for, a city of strangers, where no one asked too many questions, and where fortunes could be made from charm, ambition, and ruthlessness. He secured a job at a drugstore owned by an elderly woman. Within months, he had convinced her to sign over the business to him. When she later disappeared, no one seemed to know why. Holmes simply explained that she had moved away, and with his charm and confidence, few doubted him. The drugstore became his first foothold in Chicago, a place where he sold medicine and cures by day, while plotting schemes by night. Holmes was not content to be a simple pharmacist. He wanted more control, more power, more opportunity, to indulge the darker desires that had grown with him since childhood. Across the street from the drugstore, he purchased a plot of land and began constructing a building that would come to define his legacy. It would be 3 stories high, designed as a hotel, a labyrinth of rooms and hallways. To the outside world, it was a respectable business venture, the World's Fair Hotel, meant to house the flood of visitors arriving for the grand exposition. To Holmes, it was something else entirely, a structure built to conceal horrors, a machine for murder. The design was bizarre, full of contradictions and inexplicable features. Rooms without windows, staircases that led nowhere, doors that opened into brick walls, secret passageways, hidden chutes, airtight chambers connected to gas lines, and a basement outfitted with acid vats, furnaces, and dissecting tables. Construction workers were hired and fired constantly, so no single person understood the full layout of the building. Holmes explained it as poor management or sudden financial trouble. In reality, it was deliberate. He alone knew the design, and he alone would decide how it was used. But that part of the story belongs to later. In these early years, what mattered most was the man himself. To the people of Chicago, Holmes was a respected doctor, a successful businessman, and a charming figure in the neighborhood. To the women he courted, he was attentive, generous, and protective. To his creditors, he was slippery and elusive, always vanishing when debts came due. And to those who disappeared in his orbit, he was the last face they ever saw. His ability to manipulate was his most dangerous weapon. He did not need brute force, he had persuasion, and persuasion opened doors that violence couldn't. He could make a woman believe she had found her savior, only to discover too late that she had stepped into a trap. He could convince a business partner that wealth was just around the corner, only to betray him when it suited his needs. The story of H. Holmes is not only one of murder, but of transformation. It is the tale of a boy from a small New England town who learned early how to mask cruelty with charm, who discovered that death could be profitable, who understood that the world would believe a handsome smile more readily than it would believe a victim's cry. It is the story of how Herman Webster Mudgett became H. Holmes, a man who would later stand before the world and say without hesitation that he was born with the devil inside him. And as Chicago prepared to welcome millions to its great exposition, Holmes prepared something of his own, a stage set not for wonder and progress, but for death, deception, and horror. Holmes first began drawing up the plans for the building that would later be known as the Murder Castle. No one in Chicago could have imagined the true purpose behind his design. On the surface, the structure seemed to be nothing more than an ambitious business project, a hotel that would capitalize on the flood of visitors expected for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Chicago was alive with growth, a city of steel and smoke where fortunes were built seemingly overnight. Investors, shopkeepers, and entrepreneurs dreamed of profiting from the fair, and Holmes appeared to be one of them. He presented himself as a successful young doctor, a businessman, with impeccable manners, a man full of vision. But what Holmes was actually building was something that no one could have conceived, a labyrinth engineered not for lodging and comfort, but for control, secrecy, and death. The lot he chose sat at the corner of 63rd Street and Wallace Avenue, directly across from his own drugstore. It was prime real estate, a spot guaranteed to capture the flow of fairgoers and travelers. Holmes purchased the property under the pretense of building a respectable hotel and retail space, but the construction quickly revealed itself to be odd, even baffling. Neighbors watched as the three-story structure slowly rose, a patchwork of unfinished walls, oddly placed windows, and staircases that seemed to lead nowhere. The workers hired to build it were constantly rotated out, fired without explanation, and replaced by new crews. No architect, no contractor, and no single laborer ever had a complete picture of the building's final design. This revolving door of employees was not a product of poor management, as Holmes later pretended. It was deliberate. Each worker was given only a fragment of the plans, so none could understand the whole. The bricklayers built walls where no doors connected. Carpenters constructed chambers that had no windows, no exits. Plumbers installed strange pipework that led into concealed rooms. Gas fitters laid lines that ended abruptly in hidden spaces. To the casual observer, it was a messy, confused project. To Holmes it was perfect. Every inconsistency, every strange angle, every false wall was calculated. He wanted no one but himself to understand the true nature of what was being built. The ground floor of the building appeared ordinary enough, filled with storefronts that Holmes leased to local businesses. A jewelry shop, a pharmacy extension, and retail spaces lined the street, lending the facade of a respectable commercial block. But it was the second and third floors where Holmes's imagination came to life. This was the so-called hotel, designed to house guests, employees, and young women seeking work in the bustling city. To outsiders it was simply lodging, but to those unfortunate enough to stay, it was a trap disguised as hospitality. The layout of the upper floors defied reason. There were rooms with oddly slanted walls and no windows, hallways twisted back on themselves, leading to dead ends. Some doors opened into solid brick, as though placed there to confuse or imprison. Certain chambers were soundproofed, sealed so tightly that no scream could escape. A few were fitted with gas jets connected directly to hidden pipes, allowing Holmes to suffocate occupants at will. Others contained trapdoors leading to chutes, narrow shafts that plunged straight down to the basement. In these spaces, Holmes could dispose of bodies swiftly, sending them sliding into the hidden depths of the building, far from the eyes of guests or neighbors. The basement itself was perhaps the most horrifying part of all. Below the bustling street, beneath the respectable storefronts, and the polished hotel lobby, lay a chamber of horrors. Holmes filled it with vats of acid, quicklime pits, dissecting tables, and a massive furnace that burned hot enough to destroy almost anything. Here, bodies could be reduced to ash, bones stripped clean, evidence dissolved, and if the corpses were not disposed of, Holmes had another profitable outlet. Thanks to his medical training and his connections, he could articulate skeletons and sell them to medical schools for study. He turned human lives into profit, erasing his crimes with the precision of a businessman, balancing a ledger. It is easy in hindsight to imagine the building as something monstrous, a castle designed for terror. But in those years, to the people of Inglewood, it was simply another hotel, another project, In a city filled with noise and construction, Holmes's charm shielded him from suspicion. He greeted visitors with a smile, introduced himself as Dr. Holmes, and promised that his building would bring business and opportunity to the neighborhood. When creditors came knocking, demanding payment for materials, Holmes stalled with elaborate excuses, convincing some that riches from the World's Fair would soon cover every debt. He bought supplies on credit, then refused to pay, exploiting the trust of merchants who believed in his polished words. Some contractors never saw their wages, their tools, or even their equipment again. Holmes's manipulation extended to every part of the project. He would commission a blueprint from one architect, then dismiss him suddenly, and hire another, each one left with only fragments of the final design. At times Holmes feigned incompetence, pretending to misunderstand the process of construction, when in fact, he was orchestrating every detail. He enjoyed the confusion he sowed, the way no one could pin him down, the way suspicion evaporated beneath his polite explanations. He was building not just a structure, but an elaborate mask. When the World's Columbian Exposition was announced, Chicago exploded with anticipation. Millions of visitors were expected, men and women from every corner of the world, drawn to the grand displays of innovation, culture, and progress. Hotels across the city prepared for the influx, expanding their capacity, advertising their services. Holmes, ever the opportunist, saw his building as a gold mine. He advertised it as the World's Fair Hotel, a respectable establishment where travelers could rest just minutes away from the fairground. Young women arriving alone in the city, eager for adventure and employment, found themselves welcomed by Holmes's charming demeanor and promises of safe lodging. Many never left. The building became a stage for Holmes's double life. In the daylight, guests checked in, businesses hummed on the ground floor, and Holmes himself presented the image of a model entrepreneur. At night, however, the hidden mechanisms of the building revealed their true purpose. Doors locked from the outside, gas lines hissed through hidden pipes, trapdoors swung open beneath unsuspecting victims. Holmes could observe from hidden peepholes, watching as panic set in, as victims realized the walls around them were not designed for shelter, but for confinement. And when the terror was finished, when life was extinguished, the body would vanish down a chute, as though the building itself had swallowed its prey. What is perhaps most disturbing about the construction of the murder castle is how deliberate it was. Holmes had envisioned this, not as a crime of passion, not as a sudden impulse, but as a business model. He was methodical, patient, and meticulous. Every wall, every lock, every passage had a purpose. It was murder disguised as architecture, cruelty embedded in brick and mortar. He was not only a killer, but an engineer of death, a man who used his education, his intelligence, and his charm to build a factory of suffering. Neighbors would later recall that Holmes' hotel had always seemed peculiar, but not in a way that suggested murder. Rather, they found it confusing, strange, even eccentric. They could not have guessed the truth that lurked behind its walls. The building was, after all, in a neighborhood filled with newcomers, where change was constant, and oddities were easily ignored. People came and went, businesses opened and closed, and Holmes blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the city. He was a man of many faces, always polite, always composed, never betraying the secret purpose of his creation. By the time the building was finished, Holmes had everything he needed. The storefronts generated income, the hotel offered a steady stream of victims, and the basement gave him the means to erase evidence almost completely. He had constructed the perfect machine for his desires, a place where he controlled every door, every lock, every breath of air. And the world, dazzled by the marvels of the coming fair, remained unaware that just blocks away stood a monument not to progress but to horror. Holmes himself seemed to relish the duality of his creation. In public he showed off the hotel with pride, boasting of its fine accommodations and modern conveniences. In private he wandered its secret halls, a master of a world only he could fully understand. The building was his kingdom, a place where he reigned with absolute power, where human lives became raw material for his experiments in control and cruelty. And like the fair itself, which promised wonder and awe, Holmes' hotel promised comfort and safety.
while concealing a darker reality. As construction came to an end and the fair drew near, Holmes was ready. His mask was secure, his stage was set, and his castle was waiting. Soon, the influx of visitors would arrive, flooding the streets of Chicago, filling hotels, seeking entertainment, lodging and opportunity. They would come with open hearts, trusting in the bright promises of the new age, and among them would be those who crossed the threshold of Holmes' hotel, unaware that they had stepped not into a sanctuary, but into a carefully crafted trap. For Holmes, the murder castle was not simply a building. It was the embodiment of everything he had become: deception made solid, cruelty built into walls, a monument to the darkness that had grown in him since childhood. And soon, it would begin to serve its purpose. In 1893, Chicago became the center of the world. The World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, was more than just a celebration of progress. It was a spectacle, unlike anything America had ever seen, stretching over hundreds of acres, filled with dazzling pavilions, grand architecture, exhibits of science, art and culture. It promised a glimpse of the future itself. Electric lights glowed against the night sky. The first Ferris wheel towered above the fairgrounds, spinning visitors high into the air. Nations from across the globe built exhibits, and companies unveiled inventions that would define the coming century. It was a celebration of innovation and ambition, a monument to humanity's potential. And in the midst of this dazzling optimism, H. Holmes saw not wonder, but opportunity. Chicago swelled with strangers, men and women arriving from towns and cities across the nation, and from foreign countries too. They came by train, by carriage, and on foot, all eager to experience the marvels of the fair. The city's hotels overflowed, boarding houses filled with young women searching for work, streets buzzed with languages from every corner of the world. It was a place where identities blurred, where strangers were anonymous, and where disappearances could easily be overlooked in the chaos of so many comings and goings. For Holmes, it was the perfect hunting ground. His hotel, positioned conveniently near the fairgrounds, was advertised as the World's Fair Hotel. Travelers, dazzled by the sheer scale of the event, saw it as a welcome refuge. Just outside the bustle of the exposition, families checked in with their luggage, single men sought lodging for a few nights, and young women full of excitement and independence arrived, seeking employment in the booming city. Holmes welcomed them all with his usual charm, greeting guests with a smile, offering promises of safety and comfort. He was polite, attentive, and always carried himself as a man of wealth and refinement. In the eyes of strangers, he was trustworthy, respectable, and kind. But beneath the surface, his intentions were far darker. The fair brought with it a flood of opportunity, and Holmes wasted none of it. Women especially were drawn to Chicago, eager for jobs in the new department stores as clerks, typists, or salesgirls. The fair itself required thousands of employees to keep its exhibits running. Many of these women traveled alone, without family or friends in the city. They were ideal targets, vulnerable, trusting, and often eager to believe the promises of a well-dressed doctor, offering lodging or employment. Holmes hired some of them to work at his hotel or his drugstore. He flirted with others, convincing them of his affections, luring them into his confidence. Once inside his orbit, many were never seen again. The scale of the fair provided cover for the disappearance. With so many people arriving and leaving every day, a single missing woman raised little alarm. Families assumed letters had been delayed, that travel plans had changed, that their daughters were simply caught up in the excitement of the fair. Chicago police, overwhelmed with the sheer volume of visitors and petty crimes, had little time to investigate every missing person. In the eyes of the city, it was not unusual for a young woman to vanish, but in reality, many of those disappearances led directly to Holmes' doors. Holmes' hotel was unlike any other lodging in Chicago. Guests who entered its halls often found themselves unsettled, though they could not explain why. The layout was confusing. Corridors twisted unexpectedly, doors locked from the outside, and staircases ended abruptly. Some guests left quickly, unnerved by the strange architecture. but others stayed, reassured by Holmes' charm, unaware that the building had been designed as a trap. Those who checked in and never checked out often vanished without a trace, their names fading into the endless lists of visitors who passed through the city during the fair. Holmes's ability to blend respectability with predation was his greatest weapon. He attended the fair himself, strolling through the pavilions, watching the Ferris wheel, marveling at the grand exhibits. Like any other visitor, he spoke with business partners, courted women, and played the role of a gentleman. To those who met him briefly, he seemed harmless, even admirable. They could not have imagined that just blocks away, in his carefully constructed hotel, lives were ending in hidden chambers, screams swallowed by soundproof walls, bodies dropped into chutes that carried them to the basement. The fair was a place of dreams, but for Holmes it was also a marketplace. He not only lured victims into his hotel, but also profited from their deaths. He sold skeletons to medical schools, teeth to dentists, organs to researchers. Each body was an opportunity, a resource to be exploited. To Holmes, murder was not merely an indulgence of cruelty, it was a business model. The fair provided a constant flow of new victims and ensured that disappearances would be lost in the tide of visitors. Some of Holmes' victims were women he seduced, using his charm and false promises of marriage. He had a gift for making women feel chosen, special, adored. Letters survive from women who wrote to Holmes with affection, unaware that they were writing to their own executioner. Others were employees, hired with promises of steady work, only to discover too late that their employer was not a benefactor, but a predator. Still others were simply travelers, strangers passing through Chicago, who trusted the wrong man. Their names in many cases are lost to history, erased by the fire that later consumed the hotel, and by Holmes' own meticulous disposal of evidence. But the pattern is undeniable. The fair gave him cover, and the city gave him prey. Chicago itself was bursting at the seams, a city caught between progress and corruption. While the fair displayed the wonders of the modern age, the streets outside were crowded with poverty, crime, and desperation. Holmes thrived in this environment, where wealth and ambition mingled with deceit and exploitation. He charmed creditors into extending him loans, then disappeared before payment came due. He persuaded suppliers to deliver furniture and materials, then refused to pay, hiding behind a maze of false names and forged documents. The fair brought optimism to Chicago, but it also brought chaos, and in chaos, Holmes thrived. It is said that at night, while the lights of the fair dazzled visitors, Holmes would wander his hotel, checking the locks, inspecting the hidden passages, ensuring that every detail was in place. The building was his creation, his private kingdom, and with the fair filling his rooms with guests, he had all the material he needed. In the silence of the soundproof chambers, he controlled life and death with the turn of a key, the hiss of gas through a pipe, the swing of a trapdoor. And in the basement, the furnace roared, reducing human bodies to ash, while the city above celebrated progress and wonder. The irony of the World's Columbian Exposition was not lost on Holmes. While the fair celebrated humanity's brightest achievements, he embodied its darkest impulses. Visitors marveled at the power of electricity, the promise of modern medicine, the achievements of science. Holmes, once a medical student, perverted those same sciences for murder. He used his knowledge of anatomy to dispose of bodies, his understanding of chemistry to dissolve evidence, his skill at deception to lure victims. The fair was a testament to progress, and Holmes's hotel was a monument to corruption. As the fair continued, rumors began to circulate in the neighborhood around Holmes's hotel. Some noticed that women who entered the building often failed to reappear. Others whispered about strange smells drifting from the furnace, about odd noises at night. But Holmes was always ready with an explanation. He charmed away suspicion, claiming that the women had left for better opportunities, that the smells were from experiments, that the noises were the creaks of a new building. Few dared to challenge him directly. After all, he was a doctor, a businessman, a man of education. His reputation shielded him, even as bodies disappeared within his walls. By the height of the fair, Holmes's World's Fair Hotel was a busy place, full of travelers, employees and lodgers. Some checked in and checked out safely, leaving with stories of their visit to Chicago. Others simply vanished, absorbed into the anonymity of a city that was too busy to notice. To Holmes, each disappearance was another success, another proof of his genius. He controlled the flow of life through his building as though he were orchestrating a symphony, and no one, not even the thousands of visitors walking past his door each day, suspected the true horror that lay just beyond the threshold. The fair came to symbolize the triumph of America, a nation on the rise, full of optimism and ambition. But for Holmes it symbolized something else, a stage for his crimes, a perfect cover for his desires, a river of humanity from which he could pluck victims at will. The contrast could not have been starker. While millions celebrated the future, one man in their midst built a future of death. The white city of the fair, gleaming with light and hope, stood in cruel opposition to the dark castle of Holmes, where shadows reigned and screams were silent. And as the fair dazzled the world, Holmes smiled his polite, charming smile, shaking hands, tipping his hat, greeting guests with kindness. No one saw the truth behind his eyes. No one knew that Chicago's grandest event was not only a celebration of progress, but also the hunting ground for America's most terrifying predator.
The guests who entered H.H. Holmes' hotel never suspected what lay beyond its respectable facade. From the street, the building appeared ordinary enough. A three-story structure of red brick with tidy storefronts on the ground floor and neat windows above. It was unremarkable in a city crowded with new construction, just another enterprise in the busy neighborhood near the fairgrounds. To the passerby, there was nothing sinister about it. Inside, the lobby was well kept, with polished counters, courteous service, and Holmes himself often greeting visitors with a gentleman's smile. But behind the charm, behind the doors that clicked quietly shut, lay a world designed for control, for secrecy, and for death. The second and third floors were where the deception revealed itself. At first glance, they resembled an ordinary hotel, rooms for lodgers, hallways stretching between them, doors marked with numbers. Yet once inside, guests began to notice peculiarities. The hallways did not run straight, but twisted, doubling back on themselves. Corridors ended abruptly in blank walls. Staircases stopped short at ceilings or led nowhere at all. Some doors opened into brick partitions, others locked automatically from the outside, trapping anyone foolish enough to step inside. To those unfamiliar with the layout, it felt confusing, almost disorienting, as though the building itself resisted navigation. For Holmes, that was precisely the point. The hotel was not built for comfort. It was built as a labyrinth, a maze in which he alone held the map. Within this maze, certain chambers were unlike anything seen in a normal hotel. One was small and windowless, its walls packed with insulation that muffled every sound. Guests who found themselves inside could scream until their throats bled, but no one outside would hear a thing. Another room contained a gas jet hidden within the walls, connected by pipes to a control Holmes kept in his office. He could turn a valve, flooding the room with invisible fumes, watching through a peephole as his victims gasped for air, clawed at the door, and collapsed in silence. Other rooms were rigged with hidden trapdoors that opened suddenly, sending occupants tumbling into narrow chutes that dropped straight to the basement. The basement was the heart of the horror, the place where the building's design revealed its true purpose. Down narrow steps, past heavy locked doors, lay a chamber unlike anything in Chicago. Here stood vats filled with corrosive acid, pits lined with lime, dissecting tables stained with use, and looming over it all, a massive furnace. The furnace was large enough to cremate a human body, hot enough to turn flesh and bone to ash. It roared at night, flames flickering against the basement walls, consuming the evidence of what had taken place above. In this place, Holmes erased the traces of his crimes, leaving little more than a handful of ashes or bones, if anything at all. When not burned, Bodies could be stripped of their flesh, skeletons articulated, and sold to medical schools. Every death had its use. Holmes profited not just from the lives he took, but from the remains he left behind. For those who passed through the hotel, the experience was one of unease, though few could articulate why. Some visitors spoke later of the unsettling way doors clicked shut, of rooms that seemed too quiet, of hallways that made them feel lost. Yet in Holmes's presence, suspicions melted away. His charm disarmed them. He was attentive, polite, sometimes even tender. He offered work to young women, comfort to travelers, companionship to those who seemed lonely. He made each person feel chosen, special, as though he were offering them an opportunity or affection that others could not provide. Once inside his grasp, however, escape was nearly impossible. The victims who entered Holmes's castle often had no idea of the danger they faced until it was far too late. Women he courted found themselves locked in rooms that seemed normal until the gas began to flow. Travelers lodging for the night discovered that their doors would not open again, their knocks unanswered, their voices swallowed by silence. Employees working in the building vanished quietly, their families receiving no letters, no explanations, just absence. To the city outside, these disappearances were unremarkable, mere drops in the ocean of strangers who flowed through Chicago during the fair. To Holmes they were victories, carefully planned and meticulously executed. He moved through his castle like a conductor directing an orchestra. He knew which valves to turn, which doors to lock, which passages to open. From his office, he could monitor the building's hidden systems, adjusting them at will. The hotel itself was his instrument, each chamber a note, each mechanism a sound in the music of his cruelty. He was not merely killing, he was orchestrating, directing, controlling every moment. And in this control he found satisfaction, not only in the act of murder, but in the precision of the process. One of Holmes's favored methods was suffocation. Victims placed in airtight rooms slowly realized that their supply of oxygen was vanishing. They beat against the walls, clawed at the doors, screamed into the void. Some rooms had small peepholes through which Holmes could watch, observing their final moments as though conducting an experiment. He was detached, clinical, fascinated by their struggles. In other instances, he relied on the gas jets, turning valves to send invisible death into sealed chambers. The victims, often women who had trusted him completely, collapsed without ever understanding how or why. The chutes to the basement were another of his sinister inventions. Once a body was lifeless, Holmes could dispose of it quickly and discreetly. He would open a trapdoor, and the corpse would slide down the shaft into the waiting darkness below. From there he had choices: the furnace for cremation, the acid for dissolution, or the dissecting table for study. The efficiency of it was chilling. His castle was not merely a place of murder, it was a factory of death, designed to process human lives into profit, amusement, or ash. Neighbors occasionally noticed strange occurrences around the building. Some reported foul odors drifting from the furnace, acrid smoke rising into the night sky. Others heard odd noises, metallic clangs, or muffled cries that they dismissed as imagination. When asked, Holmes always had an explanation. The furnace, he claimed, was for heating or for experimental glasswork. The noises were the sounds of construction, of renovations, for his ever-expanding business. His answers were so calm, so convincing, that suspicions melted away. After all, he was Dr. Holmes, the well-spoken, educated businessman who employed locals and charmed investors. Who could imagine that the truth was far darker than anyone dared suspect? The castle was more than a place. It was an extension of Holmes himself. Its walls mirrored his deception, outwardly respectable, inwardly twisted. Its rooms reflected his nature, chambers of charm and comfort, masking spaces of cruelty and death. Every brick seemed infused with his duplicity, every passage an echo of his lie. He had created a building that was both a sanctuary and a snare, a place that promised safety while delivering horror. In Chicago, amid the bright lights of the fair, Holmes had constructed his own private theater of suffering. And perhaps most chilling of all was how easily he moved between worlds. One moment he was shaking hands with businessmen, strolling through the fairgrounds,
admiring inventions, laughing with companions. The next he was locking a door, turning a valve, watching as life drained from the eyes of a victim trapped in one of his chambers. He carried death with him like a secret no one else could see, hidden behind his courteous smile and polished manners. The contrast was stark, the deception perfect. What took place inside the murder castle was not random violence, but deliberate cruelty, calculated with the precision of an engineer. Holmes killed not in rage, but in cold detachment, studying, experimenting, perfecting his method. He turned murder into a science, and his hotel into a laboratory. The guests who entered his doors became subjects in his hidden experiments, stripped of their identities, reduced to tools for his dark curiosity. Their screams, their struggles, their final moments, were absorbed into the walls of the building, swallowed by the soundproof chambers, erased in the flames of the furnace. To this day, the true number of victims inside Holmes's castle is unknown. Some say dozens, others hundreds. Records were poor, names were lost, and the building itself, later gutted by fire, destroyed much of the evidence. What remains are fragments, hints, whispers of lives, cut short within its walls. But whether the number was 20 or 200, the truth is clear. Holmes had created a machine for murder, and the fair had given him endless fuel to feed it. As the days and nights passed, as the fair dazzled visitors with wonders of the future, Holmes's castle consumed its victims quietly, hidden from sight. It stood as an invisible counterpart to the White City of the Exposition, a dark city within a city, ruled by one man's cruelty. Guests stepped inside seeking rest, safety, and adventure, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. And through it all, Holmes moved calmly, smiling, polite, his footsteps echoing in the labyrinth he alone understood. The murder castle was more than just a building. It was a symbol of Holmes's mind, a place where charm cloaked cruelty, where walls concealed horrors, where every door held a secret. Inside its chambers, dreams ended, lives were extinguished, and one man's insatiable hunger for control was fed again and again. And as the fair continued to shine its bright lights across Chicago, inside the castle darkness reigned. The World's Fair in Chicago was a magnet for dreamers, travelers, and workers alike. Millions came to see the marvels of modern invention: electric lights, moving walkways, the towering Ferris wheel. The city itself buzzed with opportunity, and for young women in particular it promised independence, adventure, and the possibility of a new life. But for those who crossed paths with Henry Howard Holmes, the man with the soft voice and charming smile, the dream often ended in silence. Behind the hotel's respectable front doors, guests and employees alike vanished, their names fading from records, their lives erased as though they had never existed. One of the first to be lured into Holmes's web was Julia Smythe, a woman who worked in the jewelry counter of the pharmacy Holmes purchased. Julia was attractive, outspoken, and caught Holmes's attention almost immediately. She left her husband, staying on in Holmes's employment while becoming his lover, her young daughter Pearl often in tow. To friends, Holmes appeared devoted to Julia, but devotion was never part of his nature. He saw her as property, as useful for a time until the moment she became a burden. Julia began pressing him for marriage, demanding security for herself and her child. Holmes promised it would happen soon, just after certain legal matters were settled. Then one Christmas Eve, Julia and Pearl disappeared. Holmes explained to curious neighbors that Julia had suddenly left town, that she had gone away to visit relatives and would not be returning. But Julia never sent letters, never appeared again. She and her daughter had walked into the castle's embrace, and they were never seen alive outside its walls. Then came Emmeline Segron, a bright young stenographer who came to work for Holmes in 18. To her, Holmes presented himself as a benefactor, a man who valued her intelligence, and offered her both employment and attention. Soon their relationship grew more personal. Holmes proposed marriage, dangling before her the dream of wealth and stability. She confided in friends that she was engaged, that she was preparing for a new life, with the handsome doctor, who had swept her off her feet. But like Julia before her, Emmeline soon vanished. Witnesses last saw her entering the castle. After that, nothing. Holmes claimed she had married another man and left Chicago, but there were no records, no correspondence, No trace of her ever again. Later, when police investigated, fragments of a woman's bones and hair would be found among Holmes's tools, silent testimony to what had really occurred. The disappearances continued, each story unfolding in much the same way. A woman would meet Holmes, charmed by his attention, drawn in by his promises of work or romance. She would enter his hotel, moving into one of its rooms with hope in her eyes, and soon after, she would be gone. The pattern was so consistent, so methodical, that in hindsight it appears obvious. Yet at the time, in a city overflowing with strangers, disappearances were easy to overlook. Families assumed their daughters had moved on, eloped, or sought work elsewhere. The bustle of the fair provided cover, swallowing missing persons into its sea of faces. Holmes relied on this chaos. He knew that in the tide of humanity sweeping through Chicago, a few lost souls would not draw attention. Minnie Williams was another of his victims, and perhaps the most tragic. She was a young woman from Texas, who inherited a small fortune in property. Holmes, ever the opportunist, saw in her not just a companion, but a source of wealth. He courted her, persuaded her of his affection, and eventually convinced her to transfer the deed of her inheritance into his name. Minnie believed she had found a protector, someone who would cherish her. Holmes assured her that they would live together in comfort, that her future was secure in his hands. Her sister Nanny came to visit, perhaps wary of Holmes's intention. She too entered the castle, and neither sister was seen again. Holmes's greed had consumed not only their lives, but also the fortune they carried, leaving behind no trace but paperwork signed in his favor. For each victim, Holmes constructed a story to mask their disappearance. Julia had gone to visit relatives. Emmeline had married and moved away. The Williams sisters had returned to the South. To acquaintances who asked, Holmes provided calm explanations, convincing enough that few pressed further. He relied on the transient nature of Chicago, a city where people were always arriving and departing, where it was normal for young women to move suddenly, chasing work or romance. In truth, their journeys ended in the gas-filled chambers, the sealed rooms, the chute to the basement furnace. Their lives, their voices, their futures were extinguished, and their remains dissolved into nothingness, or sold to medical schools as anonymous skeletons. Some of his victims were not lovers or companions, but employees who worked within the castle itself. Stenographer, a chambermaid, a secretary. Each woman hired by Holmes vanished in turn. Their families wrote letters that went unanswered. Their wages stopped. Their names faded from employment rolls. Holmes explained that they had quit, that they had moved on, and no one questioned him. The fair had created a labor market of constant turnover. Disappearances could be explained as ambition or wanderlust. Few suspected the truth, that the building itself was devouring them, their bodies swallowed by the very place they thought would provide work and security. Even children were not safe. There are whispers, though difficult to confirm, that Holmes lured not only women but also the young, promising sweets or trinkets, then leading them into the maze of his hotel. In an age when child labor was common and parental supervision limited, it would not have been unusual for children to wander the bustling streets alone. Whether or not every rumor was true, there is little doubt that some of Holmes's victims were far too young. Their lives ended before they had scarcely begun. Holmes was not careless. Each disappearance was calculated, each lie constructed with care. He wrote letters to families in his victims' names, pretending they had moved on. He forged documents, created false trails, and when necessary, he used his skill with corpses to remove all evidence. His medical training gave him the ability to dissect bodies, to reduce them to skeletons that could be cleaned and reassembled, then sold legally, as anatomical specimens. For him, death was not only a thrill but also a source of income. The fair provided buyers, universities, and private collectors eager for anatomical displays. Holmes fed that demand with the remains of those who had trusted him. Perhaps most chilling was the casualness with which he moved from victim to victim. He did not dwell on those he killed, did not mourn or hesitate. Each life was simply a transaction, each body a resource. His conscience was absent, replaced by an appetite that seemed insatiable. He would smile at one woman in the morning, whisper promises of marriage, and by nightfall she might already be dead, her body tumbling down a chute into the basement furnace. The cycle repeated, over and over, until the building itself seemed saturated with death. Rumors began to swirl. Some neighbors whispered about the smoke rising from the furnace at odd hours, about the women who came to work in the building and never returned. But Holmes was always ready with explanations. The smoke was from glasswork, he said, or from experiments he was conducting. The women had found better opportunities, he assured, or had married men elsewhere. His manner was so calm, so convincing, that suspicions were soothed. After all, he was a doctor, a gentleman, a businessman of standing in the community. Few could imagine the monstrous truth hiding behind his polite smile. The sheer number of missing persons linked to Holmes is staggering, though the exact count will never be known. Some historians estimate dozens, others believe it may have been over 200. The records are too incomplete, the evidence too scattered to be certain, but what is clear is that the fair provided him with an endless supply of victims, and his castle provided the perfect stage for their disappearance. Each new arrival in Chicago carried the risk of never leaving. Each stranger who passed through Holmes' doors faced a fate they could never have foreseen. The tragedy of Holmes's victims is not only in the way their lives ended, but in the way their stories were erased. For many, there are no graves, no remains to mourn. Their families never knew what became of them, never received closure or final words. They vanished into the smoke of the furnace, into the acid baths of the basement, into the silence of rooms where no sound could escape. Their absence was their only legacy, their names lost to time, except in the shadow of the man who took their lives. Holmes thrived in this silence. Each disappearance gave him confidence. Each successful lie emboldened him further. He moved with ease between his two worlds, the charming doctor who attended the fair by day, and the calculating killer who orchestrated death by night. His victims were drawn to him like moths to flame, and like the flame, he consumed them utterly, leaving nothing behind but ash. In Chicago, amid the brilliance of the White City, Holmes built his own city of shadows, populated by the vanished, Julia and Pearl Smythe, Emmeline Segrin, Minnie and Nanny Williams, the stenographers, the maids, the secretaries, the unnamed travelers who checked into the hotel and never checked out. Their names echo faintly through history, reminders of the lives extinguished within those walls. Each story different, each ending the same. Each life intersected briefly with Holmes's charm, and each was claimed by the darkness of his castle. And as the fair continued, as millions walked the bright streets outside, the castle kept swallowing its victims, one by one, silently feeding the appetite of the man who stood at its center. The glitter of the World's Fair faded, its grand halls dismantled, its lights extinguished. Chicago, once a beacon of marvels, slipped back into the grime and shadows of ordinary life. But for Henry Howard Holmes, the disappearance of the fair did not mean the end of his schemes. The castle still stood, its labyrinth of secret rooms waiting, yet in the absence of the fair's endless tide of strangers, the walls that had concealed his deeds began to feel closer, less forgiving. The very city that had provided cover now left him exposed. Holmes had always been a man in motion, a chameleon who thrived on shifting identities. Even before the fair, his life was a string of deceptions, frauds, cons, unpaid debts, and swindles, each new city offering him the chance to reinvent himself. But in Chicago, his ambitions had grown monstrous. With the fair over, suspicion began to stir. Creditors grew restless. Families started asking about loved ones who had vanished. The smoke that once drifted unnoticed from the castle's furnace became a reminder of unanswered questions. Holmes, sensing the walls of suspicion creeping closer, did what he had always done when trouble loomed. He ran. He left Chicago behind, and set his sights elsewhere, weaving fresh lies as he went. He married again, his third wife, Georgiana Yoke, a woman who believed she had found a respectable if mysterious husband. With her he crafted the appearance of stability, the perfect gentleman with charm and ambition. Yet even as he played the role of devoted husband, Holmes's mind churned with new schemes. He was a man who could not rest without deception, who needed the thrill of fraud, and the promise of quick money as much as he needed air. It was during this restless wandering that Holmes encountered Benjamin Pitezel, a man whose weakness would seal both their fates. Pitezel was a carpenter by trade, an alcoholic with a tendency to trust the wrong people. Holmes saw in him a pawn, someone pliable, desperate and useful. Together, they devised a scheme, so audacious it might have succeeded. Had Holmes been content with mere fraud, they would stage Pitezel's death, collect on a hefty life insurance policy, and share the spoil. It was a plan Holmes had used before on smaller scales, manipulating paperwork and death certificates, but this time the stakes were higher. In September of 1894, the plan came to light. Holmes told Pitezel to assume a false identity as an inventor in Philadelphia, renting a modest office where he could stage the fatal accident. The idea was simple. Pitezel would be found dead from a supposed laboratory explosion, his body charred beyond recognition. Holmes would supply a substitute corpse, and the insurance company would pay out $10,000, a fortune at the time. Holmes assured Pitezel that he would handle everything, that he had the medical knowledge and connections to make the deception flawless. But Holmes never intended for Pitezel to share in the profit. Instead of finding a substitute body, he turned on his partner. Pitezel trusted him enough to drink freely, and in that drunken haze, Holmes used chloroform to render him unconscious. Then, with the same calm precision he had used on countless victims before, Holmes killed him. He poured chloroform down Pitezel's throat, ensuring his death was unmistakable. Later, when the body was found, the coroner noted the smell of chloroform, but assumed it was used in an attempt to preserve the corpse after death. Holmes's lie held fast, and the insurance company prepared to pay. For Holmes, Pitezel was just another body, another opportunity. But this death carried consequences unlike those before. Pitezel was not an anonymous woman lost in the tide of Chicago. He had a wife, children, a family who loved him. They trusted Holmes too, seeing him as a friend and benefactor. Holmes presented himself as a man devoted to their welfare, offering to help care for the children during the legal proceedings to collect the insurance money. He convinced Miss Pitezel that it would be easier if he temporarily looked after some of her children, moving them from city to city under his watch. She agreed, believing Holmes was protecting them. In truth, he was weaving the darkest chapter of his crime. The three eldest Pitezel children, Alice, Nellie and Howard, followed Holmes across the country as he shifted between hotels, boarding houses, and rented rooms. Each move was calculated to prevent suspicion, each city another stage in his deception. Holmes told Miss Pitezel conflicting stories about where her children were, assuring her they were safe, but keeping them just beyond her reach. All the while the children trusted him, calling him Mr. Holmes, never knowing that he had murdered their father and would soon decide their fates as well. Meanwhile, the insurance company began to grow suspicious. The sheer oddity of the case, combined with Holmes' reputation for fraud, drew the attention of investigators. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, relentless in pursuing swindlers, took an interest in Holmes's move. He had left too many loose ends, too many unpaid debts, too many people whispering about the vanished. His careful mask began to crack. Detectives tracked his trail from Chicago to St. Louis, then to Philadelphia, Indianapolis, Toronto. Each city bore witness to another lie, another false name, another elaborate story. But Holmes could not outrun suspicion forever. In November of 1894, he was arrested in Boston, initially on charges of horse theft in Texas. It seemed an almost laughable downfall for a man who had built a castle of horrors to be captured over something so petty. Yet the arrest was only the beginning. While in custody, investigators began unraveling the larger web. The insurance fraud, the disappearance of Pitezel's children, and whispers of countless vanished women, converged into a chilling portrait. For the first time, Holmes was trapped, unable to simply slip away with another alien. Even in prison, Holmes tried to talk his way out, spinning lies and half-truths, offering explanations that twisted reality. He insisted that Pitezel was alive, that the children were safe, that misunderstandings had piled against him. But the detectives were not so easily deceived. They pressed forward, tracing his steps, uncovering the rooms in the castle, the trapdoors, the furnaces, the bones, the newspapers, ever hungry for sensational stories, seized on every detail. The polite doctor with the boyish smile became in print a monster. Chicagoans, who had once dismissed rumors about the strange building on Wallace Avenue, now shuddered at what they had ignored. The investigation stretched across borders. In Toronto, The bodies of two Pitesale daughters were discovered in a shallow grave, their lives snuffed out on Holmes's. In Indianapolis, young Howard Pitesale's remains were found, confirming the nightmare. The man who had promised Mrs. Pitesale that he would care for her children had instead destroyed them, leaving their mother in unimaginable grief. This was no longer a matter of fraud or theft. It was murder, deliberate and cruel. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they realized the scale of Holmes's crimes stretched far beyond the Pitesale case. Witnesses stepped forward, recalling vanished relatives who had last been seen entering Holmes's hotel. Creditors described his evasions. Employees remembered women who never returned from errands within the castle. In the basement, police uncovered bones, fragments of clothing, surgical tools, stained with ink. The castle itself became a character in the investigation, a silent witness to horrors that could never be fully catalogued. Holmes's trial loomed, and with it the full weight of justice. The charming doctor who had once walked freely among Chicago's elite was now shackled, his lies collapsing one by one. He remained outwardly calm, even as the evidence mounted. He spoke eloquently in court, defending himself with practiced ease, but the stories he told could not erase the bodies unearthed, the grieving families, the undeniable proof of his betrayals. What began as a simple arrest for fraud had unraveled into one of the most chilling murder investigations of the century. Holmes, who once believed himself untouchable, now stood in a cell, the iron bars closing around him like the walls of his own castle. For the first time, he was the prisoner in a maze he could not escape.
The iron bars clanged shut, and for the first time in his restless, scheming life, Henry Howard Holmes could no longer slip into another disguise, another city, another lie. The great chameleon of Chicago, the man who had changed names and faces like others changed coats, now sat in a cell, the walls closing in like the secret corridors of his own castle. Yet even here, in confinement, Holmes carried himself with the same strange calm that had disarmed so many before. He was polite to his jailers, charming to visitors, always ready with a smile. To look at him in those early days of imprisonment was to see not a monster, but a gentleman, and that was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. The charges against him were grave. The death of Benjamin Pattisell alone was enough to put him on trial for murder, but the shadow of other crimes hung heavily over the proceedings. The disappearance of Pattisell's children, the remains uncovered in Toronto and Indianapolis, the whispers of vanished women from Chicago, all these swirled around the courtroom, even if not every accusation could be proven. The newspapers seized upon the story, splashing his face across their front pages, dubbing him the Arch-Fiend, the Monster of Chicago, and most famously, America's first serial killer. For the public, Holmes became both horror and fascination, a man who seemed too civilized, too intelligent to commit such atrocities, and yet had done so with cold precision. The trial began in Philadelphia in the courtroom filled with spectators, journalists, and those who had once been deceived by Holmes' charm. The air was thick with both outrage and anticipation, for everyone wanted to see how this strange man would answer for the horrors attributed to him. Holmes, ever the performer, chose to defend himself. He dismissed his lawyers and addressed the jury directly, weaving elaborate stories, challenging witnesses, and speaking with the smooth confidence of a seasoned orator. He painted himself as a victim of misunderstanding, a man entangled in unfortunate circumstances and betrayed by others' lies. To hear him tell it, he was not a killer but a scapegoat. Yet the evidence spoke louder than his words. The body of Benjamin Pattisell, unmistakably murdered, lay at the heart of the case. The insurance fraud scheme was laid bare, with documents and testimony proving Holmes's intent to profit from his partner's staged death. The testimony of detectives and experts revealed that the accident in Philadelphia had been no accident at all, but a carefully executed killing. When the prosecution introduced the heartbreaking evidence of Pattisell's children, their final journeys with Holmes, their tragic deaths, the courtroom gasped. Though Holmes was tried officially only for the murder of Benjamin Pattisell, the specter of the children loomed heavily, condemning him in the court of public opinion. Throughout it all, Holmes remained composed. He objected politely. He spoke with eloquence. He smiled as though the trial were merely another stage for his endless performance. Some said his confidence was unnerving, that he seemed almost amused by the proceeding. Others believed it was part of his strategy, a final attempt to manipulate the perception of those around him. But if it was, it failed. The jury deliberated only a short time before returning with a verdict: guilty. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. For a man who had controlled so many lives, the irony was undeniable. The law, at last, had stripped him of power. Yet even in the face of execution, Holmes did not behave like other men awaiting the gallows. He did not collapse into despair, nor did he rage against his fate. Instead, he began to write. From his cell in Moyamensing prison, Holmes penned a lengthy confession. The document was published widely, devoured by a public both horrified and enthralled by his crime. In it, Holmes claimed responsibility for more than 24 murders, though the accuracy of his words has been debated ever since. Some of the confessions were almost certainly lies, exaggerations designed to secure his place in infamy. Holmes, it seemed, wanted to craft his own legend, to leave behind a narrative as twisted and mysterious as the castle itself. In his writings, Holmes described himself in chilling terms. He claimed that he was born with the devil inside him, that he could not help his impulses, that his nature was set from the very beginning. To many, this was an excuse, a final manipulation meant to frame himself as something more than human, a creature of darkness rather than a man who had made choices. But the effect was undeniable. The image of Holmes as a devil in the flesh took root, shaping his legacy in ways no court could erase. As the date of his execution approached, crowds gathered outside the prison, eager to glimpse the man who had haunted their imagination. Journalists begged for interviews, eager for a final quote, a final twist of the tale. Holmes obliged, granting statements with the same calm politeness he had displayed throughout his life. He never admitted guilt in court, but in his writings he alternated between boastful confession and careful denial, as if even at the end, he could not resist keeping the world guessing. On May 7, 1896, the execution was carried out. Holmes, dressed neatly, ascended the gallows without struggle. Witnesses described his composure as eerie, his demeanor almost serene. When asked for final words, he spoke calmly, denying certain murders while leaving others ambiguous. Then the hood was placed over his head, the noose tightened around his neck, the trapdoor opened, and Holmes fell. But even in death, Holmes defied expectation. Instead of a swift end, his neck did not break. He hung there, struggling, for nearly 20 minutes, his body twitching as the crowd watched in uneasy silence. Some whispered that it was a fitting punishment, that the devil within him was refusing to let go. Others turned away, sickened by the sight. At last, his body went still, and the monster of Chicago was no more. Yet Holmes's death did not end his story. If anything, it only fueled it. The castle in Chicago became a macabre landmark, drawing curiosity seekers who wanted to walk the halls where so many had vanished. Though the building was eventually gutted by fire and later torn down, its legend grew. Ghost stories surrounded the site, whispers of cries in the walls, footsteps in the burned ruins. To this day, people speak of the murder castle as if it were alive, a structure that absorbed the evil of its maker and refused to let it go. Holmes himself remained a subject of fascination. Was he truly guilty of all the murders he confessed to, or had he exaggerated to cement his infamy? Historians debate the number of his victims, with estimates ranging from a handful to more than 200. The truth, buried in the ashes of the castle and the lies of Holmes' own words, may never be fully known. What is certain is that his crimes, proven and suspected alike, cast a long shadow over American history. He was not the first killer to stalk the land, but he was the first to be so widely covered, so thoroughly dissected in the press. In many ways, Holmes was the beginning of America's obsession with serial killers, a grim fascination that continues to this day. Even in the years that followed, rumors persisted. Some claimed Holmes had bribed his way out of prison, that the man who was hanged was not him at all but a substitute. These conspiracy theories, fed by his reputation as a master deceiver, refused to die. In 2017,
More than a century after his execution, Holmes's body was exhumed to settle the question once and for all. The examination confirmed it was indeed Holmes buried in the grave, his teeth providing the final proof. The man who had called himself the devil was truly gone, though the legend he built remains immortal. And so the tale of H. Holmes lingers, not just as a story of one man's evil, but as a mirror to the darkness hidden within society itself. He thrived because people trusted too easily, because ambition blinded them to danger, because the glitter of progress, the World's Fair, the booming city masked the shadows underneath. Holmes was a man of his age, and also beyond it, a reminder that behind every marvel there can lurk a monster, waiting. When the final chapter closed on Holmes's life, America had been introduced to a new kind of villain. No longer was crime confined to outlaws on horseback or drunken brawls in taverns. Here was something different, a man who planned, calculated, deceived, and killed with chilling deliberation, a man who built an entire building as a machine for murder, a man who smiled as he lied, who charmed as he destroyed. The story of Holmes is not just about one killer, but about the birth of a new kind of terror, one that would haunt the modern world for generations. And so, from his castle of horrors to the gallows in Philadelphia, from whispered suspicions to screaming headlines, the legacy of H. Holmes endured. His name, his crimes, his lies, they remain etched in the history of crime, a grim reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability. The devil, it seemed, had walked among men, and in the end, he had been unmasked. And that brings us to the end of the dark and twisted tale of H. Holmes, the man who turned a dream city into a nightmare, and a building into a machine of death. His murder castle may be gone, reduced to ashes and rubble, but the shadow it cast still lingers. Holmes was hanged more than a century ago, yet even now questions remain. How many people truly vanished behind those walls? How much of his confession was truth? And how much was another cruel lie? What we do know is this: he left behind more than just a crime story. He gave America its first real glimpse of the serial killer, the kind of murderer who hides behind a smile, who blends into society, who kills not in a moment of passion, but with cold calculation. In many ways, Holmes was the beginning of our obsession with monsters that look like men. So, what do you think? Was Holmes truly the devil he claimed to be, born to kill, or was he simply a man who chose evil, step by step until he could no longer turn back? And the most chilling question of all, if Holmes could thrive in the chaos of a booming city, could someone just like him be hiding in plain sight today? If this story unsettled you, or if it left you with more questions than answers, let us know in the comments. Do you believe Holmes's victim count was exaggerated, or are there still hidden graves that history has yet to uncover? If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's darkest corners, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love true crime, and subscribe for more stories of mystery, horror, and the human shadows that history often tries to forget. Because as Holmes himself once said, "I was born with the devil in me." But perhaps in uncovering stories like his, we remind ourselves of the danger and the importance of seeing evil before it smiles back at us. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and never forget, some monsters build castles, and some monsters still walk among us.